Welcome to the Dup Dive. Today we're trying something a bit different. We're looking at the idea of rights, but through the lens of Michel Foucault's later work, roughly the 70s and 80s.
Exactly. It's a really fascinating perspective, quite different from standard legal or political views. We're using a book that dives deep into his writings and lectures from that time.
Right, and the book aims to unpack his, what it calls, Foucauldian politics of rights, both the possibilities and, well, the problems.
Precisely. It's about understanding his specific take, how he thought rights could be used, but also his warnings about them.
Okay, so for you, the learner, the goal here is to get a handle on this complex, but frankly, really influential way of thinking about rights without getting totally bogged down in dense theory. We'll try to pull out the key aha
Yeah, and
moments.
the practical side of it too.
Great. So where do we start? To understand his later ideas on rights, we need to go back a bit.
We really do. We have to look at how he rethought power itself in his earlier work. He argued that traditional political theory was obsessed with the sovereign, the king, the state.
That top-down figure of authority.
Exactly. And he felt this focus kind of blinded us to how power really works in modern life on the ground.
So it's not just the government telling people what to do.
Not at all. He shifted focus to concepts like discipline and biopolitics. Think about the unspoken rules, the norms, the ways institutions like schools or workplaces subtly shape behavior. These often operate alongside formal laws.
Okay, so power is more pervasive, less obvious sometimes.
Much more. He famously said that the Enlightenment, which we celebrate for discovering liberties, also invented the disciplines, these subtle normalizing forms of control.
Wow. And this changes how we see the individual, right? Power isn't just restricting us.
Right. He argued it actually produces us. The individual isn't some pre-existing thing that power acts upon. Instead, the individual is, in his words, carefully fabricated within it.
Fabricated, that's a strong term.
It is. It really challenges the idea of a core, essential human nature that exists before society or power touches it.
And that's got huge implications for rights, doesn't it? If there's no essential human there beforehand.
Exactly. That's the core of his challenge to many traditional rights theories. Liberal rights are often grounded in this idea of an inherent human subject with intrinsic qualities or dignity. Foucault puts a big question mark next to that foundation.
Okay, so he's shaking the foundations. How does his idea of critical counterconduct fit in? Is that how we respond?
Sort of, yeah. It's his idea of what critique is or what it should do. Inspired by Kant's essay, What is Enlightenment? He saw critique less as finding the absolute truth,
And more as a
more as a practice of questioning limits, pushing boundaries, asking why this, why now? Could things be different? He called it a non-positive affirmation.
non-positive affirmation, meaning it doesn't necessarily offer a replacement, it just says no.
Pretty much. It's not about saying, here's the better system. Foucault saw it as an instrument for those who fight, those who resist and refuse what is. Its value is in destabilizing things.
So the act of refusing, of questioning itself opens up possibilities.
That's the idea. It creates space. By showing that the current way isn't the only way, it makes alternatives thinkable, maybe even achievable.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, the outline mentions a shift in his later work towards ethics. How does that connect?
Right. So around the late 1970s, his focus kind of shifts. He'd been looking at how we're made into objects by disciplines, by biopolitics. Now he starts looking more at how we make ourselves into subjects, how we actively shape ourselves.
And he looked to the ancient Greeks for this. Seems like a jump.
It does, but he found something interesting there. For certain Greek schools of thought, ethics wasn't mainly about rules or obligations to others. It was about the relationship to oneself, rapport à soi.
Like self-care or self-mastery.
Exactly. Cultivated through what he called ascetic techniques, practices aimed at shaping your own character, your way of being.
So ethics becomes less about following external rules and more about an internal practice, a kind of self-artistry.
Precisely, an ethos, a way of being constantly practiced and formed. It's about the work we do on ourselves.
Okay, so putting all this together, the view of power, the critique, the focus on self-formation, what does this Foucauldian politics of rights actually look like?
Well, first off, it's anti-foundationalist. As we said, it doesn't rely on some fixed human
So
nature,
essential human subject. Got it.
and it's non-anthropologically grounded. It doesn't start with a fixed idea of man. It's also openly political. It acknowledges rights emerge from struggle, from power dynamics.
Not just abstract principle.
Right. And it's tactically oriented. It sees rights as potential tools to intervene in specific situations within existing structures like law or the state.
And critically engaged with liberalism, not just accepting it wholesale.
Definitely. It's trying to use liberal tools, perhaps, but
Yeah.
maybe transform them in the process.
But then there's this idea of the ambivalence of rights. Suggests it's not straightforward.
Not at all. This is crucial. Rights can be tools for subjects, yes, but they can also be technologies of regulation. They shape the very subjects who use them.
How so? Can you give an example?
Okay, think about Foucault's historical analysis. He argued that sometimes rights claims emerge directly from conflict, like protecting the singular rights of family or race after wars. These weren't about universal humanity, but about survival of a specific group. Politics as a continuation of war, basically.
So rights can actually reinforce specific group identities rather than universal ones.
They can, and that connects to the regulatory aspect. Wendy Brown, building on Foucault, points out how claiming rights based on identity, say, as a member of a marginalized group, can unintentionally solidify certain norms about what it means to be part of that group. You have to perform the identity in a certain way to be legible for rights.
Like Richard Ford's critique regarding race and the Bake case.
Exactly. Ford argued that focusing on racial difference for rights claims, like in affirmative action debates, can end up codifying specific, sometimes quite narrow or even conservative, ideas of what that racial identity entails.
And the example of gay rights and marriage equality fits here too.
It does. While achieving marriage equality is obviously a major rights victory for many, critics using a Foucauldian lens, like Michael Warner or Samuel Chambers, argue it can also reinforce the state's power to define legitimate relationships.
Oh.
By making state-sanctioned marriage the primary goal, it can implicitly create a hierarchy, distinguishing between good gay citizens who marry and others whose relationships or ways of life don't fit that mold. Marriage itself becomes a kind of normalizing disciplinary institution.
Interesting tension. So how did Foucault himself engage with gay rights activism? He wasn't just critical, was he?
Oh no, definitely not just critical. He actively intervened in gay and lesbian publications in the early 80s. He strongly supported the fight for rights, like the right to choose one's sexuality and the freedom to express that.
But he saw limits to just focusing on identity.
Yes. He worried that just defending a predefined gay identity wasn't enough. He pushed for something more creative, more exploratory, the idea of becoming gay.
Becoming gay, as opposed to just being gay.
Kind of, as an aesthetic and political project, exploring new forms of relationships, new pleasures, new ways of being together, new relational possibilities, he called them, rather than just seeking inclusion within existing structures based on a fixed identity.
So rights could be a space to both define and maybe loosen that identity.
Exactly, that's the ambivalence. And he thought these explorations, happening from what he called the slantwise position of homosexuals outside the mainstream, could actually reveal new ways of relating that might enrich everyone's lives, not just gay people's.
That's a fascinating thought. Okay, let's shift gears slightly to this idea. Freedom as a precondition of power. That sounds backwards. Don't we usually think power limits freedom?
We do, in the standard liberal view. But Foucault flips it. He argues freedom isn't some innate human quality that power represses. It's more like the fundamental possibility of things being otherwise. The ontological contingency of the present, as the source puts it.
So power only works if things could be different, if people could resist.
Precisely. If there was no possibility of resistance, no instability, you wouldn't need power relations. You just have total physical constraint. So freedom, in this sense, the potential for things to shift, for power relations to be reversed, is actually inherent in power. Power requires it.
Okay, that's a mind bender. And rights fit in how?
Well, rights claims rely on that possibility of change, that freedom. And asserting rights can, in turn, help create new forms of freedom, new ways of being that weren't possible before.
But he was still skeptical of just relying on liberal rights to guarantee freedom.
Very much so. He was quite Nietzschean here. He didn't think institutions alone could secure freedom. He famously said, the guarantee of freedom is freedom. Meaning, freedom is something you have to constantly practice, fight for. It's a ceaseless work involving critique and struggle. Rights might be one tool in that struggle, but maybe not always the best one. Sometimes, as Judith Butler argues, refusing the terms offered by power is more liberating than trying to win within them.
This sounds like the difference between tactics and strategy. Can you unpack that?
Sure. Foucault often talked about using rights or laws tactically. That means using them instrumentally, for a specific, immediate goal, perhaps even in ways the law wasn't intended for. playing the game, but maybe bending the rules.
Like finding loopholes or unexpected applications.
Exactly, a localized maneuver. Now, how this relates to a larger strategy is debated. Foucault's overall model of power is often called strategic, emphasizing relationships, flux, struggle, the possibility of reversal.
Does he see tactics leading to strategy?
The book suggests that while Foucault might seem focused on local tactics, these ground-level actions can accumulate and potentially articulate a broader strategic opposition over time. Tactics bubble up.
And there's a comparison to Marxist thought here.
Yes, the book connects it to discussions in Marxist theory about revolutionary strategy, like Jacques Verges's idea of a strategy of rupture in legal defense, fundamentally challenging the system itself. Foucault actually had dialogues with Verges. So, while distinct, there's an overlap in thinking about how to confront power structures, whether through tactics or grander strategies.
Okay, let's look at a concrete case, the right to die. How did Foucault approach this complex issue?
He was critical of how it was typically framed in liberal terms. He felt the debate often got stuck within a juridico-medical order, basically reinforcing the power of doctors and lawyers to define the terms of death.
So it wasn't just about an individual's choice versus the state's interest.
Not primarily for him. He saw the subject in that debate often being framed as just a suffering patient needing palliative care rather than an active agent. His aim wasn't just to argue for the right, but to use the debate to unsettle our whole understanding of ourselves as modern subjects governed around life and death.
To make us rethink what it even means to claim such a right.
Exactly. He saw it as potentially transformative of our self-conception. And he even explored suicide in quite radical terms, didn't he? In an essay called The Simplest of Pleasures.
Yeah, that sounds provocative.
It was. He discussed it not legally or morally, but almost aesthetically, as a potential ultimate act of self-creation or refusal, pushing back against biopower's claim over life. He connected it to ancient practices like meditating on death, militu thanatu, as part of an aesthetics of existence.
Wow, okay. Then there's the death penalty. The outline says he deliberately avoided framing his opposition in terms of rights. Why? That seems the most obvious argument.
It does, doesn't it? A violation of the right to life. But the book suggests this was a calculated strategic move by Foucault.
Strategic how? What was the concern?
He seems to have been wary of endorsing a fundamental right to life in the context of biopolitics, where the state already claims its legitimacy based on protecting and managing life.
So, appealing to a right to life might inadvertently strengthen the state's overall claim to manage life and death.
That seems to be the concern. By asking the state to better respect life, you might implicitly reinforce its authority over life. Plus, he analyzed how the death penalty itself could function biopolitically, not just as punishment, but as a way to eliminate populations deemed a threat to the life of the larger society. So opposing it in the name of life becomes complicated.
That's really complex. Okay, so wrapping up, the conclusion asks, beyond the dream of revolution, where does that leave us with rights?
Well, the book sort of reflects on this shift where maybe after the decline of big revolutionary projects, international human rights took on some of that utopian energy, a way to strive for a better world.
But with caveats.
Definitely. Some critics see human rights as a kind of anti-politics, focus more on moral claims against the state, often minimalist ones like preventing torture or killing, rather than engaging in deep political or economic transformation.
So Foucault's legacy isn't a simple pro or anti-rights stance.
Not at all. It's the critical stance itself that's valuable. His enduring relevance is in pushing us to constantly examine the tools we use, like rights, to see their history, their hidden effects, their contingency, to ask how they function now in relation to power.
Okay, so let's try to boil down the key takeaways. Foucault gives us this really nuanced, critical view. Rights aren't just shields, they're active forces shaping us and shaping power. His approach highlights tactical uses, their deep ambivalence, and freedom as this ongoing practice of questioning.
That sums it up well, I think. It's a challenging perspective, but a rewarding one.
So the final thought for you, the learner. Try applying this lens. Think about a current issue involving rights that you follow. How does seeing rights as both enabling and potentially regulating change your view? What happens if you look beyond simply demanding inclusion within existing terms and ask, like Foucault, about creating new relational possibilities?
What new ways of being might open up?
Exactly. This deep dive is really just a starting point. There's so much more in Foucault's work and the scholarship around it if you want to explore further. Thanks for joining us.